Well, hi everyone. What I'm going to do in this video is just record a bit of a voiceover of over some slides from a talk that I gave the other day at Faithtech in Sheffield. Unfortunately, the recorder didn't work, and so the talk wasn't recorded. So I'm hoping this will be a good replacement. And there's questions within this. We won't have the opportunity to do the discussions here on the video that we did during the talk, but if you've got any thoughts or any answers to the questions or any pushback, very open to receive those. Feel free to use the comments. So I'm just going to get into the talk, read over the top of the slides. I'm going to get rid of my face, and we'll see how we go. So I hope this blesses you. And so this talk here is I'm calling it a talk is as towards an applied theology of technology. And the towards is important because what I'm presenting here is something that's very much a work in progress. There's no sense in which I want to be a wise sage stroking my beard, so I'm going to share some thoughts. And like I said before, feel free to leave comments. I want to hear from you. In fact, that's probably my main aim here. I want to know what you are thinking, what you are thinking about as technologists, as people of faith. I want to know what questions you are asking, because that will help me in my own exploration of where I'm coming from and where I want to go with this. But before I get into the main substance of the talk, I just want to share something of a baseline hypothesis. And this is where sort of the assumptions I'm coming forward with at the beginning. And so this is it. First of all, I want to make the assumption that technology is not inherently an evil thing. We're going to be exploring some of the goodness of technology as well as some of the dangers of it. And I also want to affirm that technology is not just a pragmatic tool. We're not just impressed by the utility of technology or what can be done by it, and as people involved in tech, that we're not just useful people. What I want to is get to a sense of its beauty and some of its inherent value. And so I want to affirm that technology has something to do with beauty and something to do with worship. And we'll unpack this as we go forward. But I want to begin by sharing something of my story. And that's not just so that you can answer the question, who is this guy and why should I listen to him? But partly because in the end, whatever we think about deeply comes from the place where we've already been to some extent. And a lot of what I want to share here is wells up from within my experiences, which I've then held and thought about and presented here. And so there are two sides to this topic, technology and theology, and I come from it from both directions. So from the theology side, this is who I am. That's a QR code to my link tree, which I'll also put in the notes to the videos if you want to find me online. This is who I am. I'm an ordained minister in the Church of England. I have been in England for the last 9.5 years, in Sheffield for 6.5. I was ordained in 2002 in the Diocese of Tasmania in Australia, and before that I studied theology at Ridley College in Melbourne, and before that computer systems engineering in the University of Tasmania, but I'll come back to that. I'm not an academic, but I am something I hope to, at least aspirationally, I am an applied theologian, a missionary, a church planter, a cross-cultural engager, and an ordinary pastor. And quite importantly, I'm also a third culture kid. You can tell from my accent that I'm not from around here. I was born in the UK, but emigrated to Australia at the age of 6, and I grew up there. I'm very much Australian, and I returned when I was 40, and by that time I was married and had 4 kids of my own. But what that means is that I fit in the category of what we call third culture kids. And third culture kids aren't sure where their home is. And so for me, there's this question, am I English or am I Australian? We are not brought up as natives, third culture kids. And so I'll put it this way. For those who are raised in the culture in which they are born, they are raised within a whole bunch of assumptions and unspoken narratives about how the world works and how their culture works. But if you have come into a culture from the outside, then you've had to learn to taste the water you're swimming in. You have to learn to detect the assumptions and to weigh them up and to work out, where am I right, where am I wrong, what is truth, what is progress, what is goodness, what matters most. These all things don't come naturally. You have to think about them. So as third culture kids, we have to learn to take what is, bring it into a more abstract world, a conceptual world where you can wrestle through with what you've experienced and what it all means, and then reapply it. And that's both useful in two senses. In some ways, that's the topic. That's what theology does. We are taking something about life's experiences and this narrative of the history of God's people in the world, and we are bringing them into a conceptual world, a symbolic world, where we can work through the frameworks, find the patterns, extrapolate, and then apply. And so theology is about embracing and knowing and exploring God's world, which is beautiful and infinite, and it's almost metaphorical. And I've been doing that, finding the patterns, looking for the structures, and working out how to apply them back out again. So I wonder, with a leading point here, about any other profession that is offered a real world problem that needs to be lifted into a mostly symbolic world in order to connect it with a more universal framework, so that problems can be solved and then can be applied back out. And of course, I'm applying that to the work of a technologist, particularly in the area of software, but it's actually more broader than that. This is what we do. A client comes to us with their real world problem. We have to take their data, take their desires for how to manipulate what they have and present it to their customers. We bring that into a conceptual world. We think it through. We make it more abstract. We have to work through whether one object that we are putting into a database, for instance, it sits alone or is a subset of something else. In other words, we're thinking things through abstractly in a conceptual world and then applying it out. This framework of thinking aligns both across the technology and the theological journey, and I want to bring them together. But let's bring it back to me and my story, because there's something of that in there. My journey began here with the Commodore 64 back in the day, which shows you my age. And if you want to let people know what Poke 53281,0 does on a Commodore 64, you can be the first in the comments to do so. Although actually, my journey actually began here with a BBC Model A or Model B, I don't know which one. When I was in a primary school, I broke my arm, and for 2 weeks I was allowed to have sole use of one of the 2 microcomputers that the school had acquired. And so during that time, I typed in basic code from the manual that came with it, and a world opened up for me. By the time I was in high school, I'd worked out how to plot quadratic equations in Mode 5 graphics mode, and also had to do things like solve simultaneous equations and things like that. But I spent most of my life here because my parents could afford a Commodore 64. And this screen, if you like, this became a world for me. I wasn't very good at exploring this world. I was like a toddler in a mud bath. But here, within the bounds of these 38911 free bytes of memory, I had a whole domain governed by numbers and symbols and predictable rules. And these were characteristics that didn't mark the rest of my life, but here in this virtual world, I could govern it. I had a world that I could rule, I could fix, I could shape, I could change, and I could even create things in this world. I could literally make things like balloons out of numbers. numbers that I could think up, push together, manipulate, and I don't say this lightly, these things would stir my soul and in my imagination. And what, as I have dwelt on that over the years, I have to be honest and recognize that one of the appeals of finding this piece of technology was that in this domain, I was Lord and Master and Creator, Controller, Protector, Defender. The I am root is a spiritual statement. And so there's already this interaction of theology with my experience of tech, and we'll come back to that. As my story continued, by the time the 90s came along and I was in sixth form and then in university, I went on to study computer systems engineering, and yes, got to use Turbo Pascal. And that's where I learned everything, a bunch of things, not everything, but a bunch of things all the way from hardware, power lines and electric motors all the way through to database systems. I ended up doing an honours project on a PowerPC code generator for the Glasgow Haskell compiler. And for those who have worked with functional languages, you'll know how it's very easy to break your brain. But by this time, in this virtual world in which I was learning some skills, I wasn't actually enjoying it very much. There was a number of reasons for that. Some politics in the university, the fact that it's functional languages. But what this allowed me to do was to pave my way into what might come next after university. And for me, that was to be involved in a company known as Trumpet Software International, which was probably one of the few, maybe one of the only software company in Tasmania that was doing anything on a global scale. And if you're my age or older, you may have heard of this. During the 1990s, Windows 3.1 machines did not ship with a Windows sockets layer. I think you could buy them off Microsoft for a lot of money. But this company, Trumpet, and its founder, Peter Tatum, put together a Windows socket layer which was released as shareware. And I don't think it's exaggerating to say that it brought forward the use of the internet worldwide by about 12 months, because it allowed, it got in there before someone else did it, and allowed Windows 3.1 machines to connect to the internet. And it was as the dot-com bubble was beginning to expand. And I was in there, I was involved in this. I helped implement a network address translation layer, which we saw as a kludge because we thought IP version 6 was about to come around the corner, and in the meantime we had to hide entire intranets behind one IP version 4 address. But so this is the experience I had in the industry, not for very long. But it was in this world that I began to have an internal shift, a more of a theological and spiritual shift, because now my creative world wasn't just in 38911 basic bytes of a Commodore 64, and it wasn't in the 4 gigabytes of addressable memory in 32-bit flat mode. It was now in an ocean of connectivity. I was now in the world of the internet, and I could set sail on that ocean. And this is back in the day when the internet was in its relative infancy. Nothing was encrypted, nothing was paywalled. If you wanted to get out on the World Wide Web in any meaningful sense, then you built your own boat and you went out to sail. You cobbled together your own airplane and you launched out into the unknown. Today we've hit the point where the internet is populated by consumers. Most people on the net are like airline passengers, whereas back in this day it was more like pioneer aviators. Back then we were explorers. I mean, I remember when audio first got condensed down to something that could fit on a floppy disk, and when MP3s were born, and it was like magic. And I remember when there was Napster and BitTorrent and all the rest of it. But what was happening here was, in this weaving together of communication, I was starting to realize that the world that I had power in, the world in which I had skills in, was no longer confined to my desk. It was something bigger and broader. And in the midst of that, I began to realize that I didn't just want to plumb the pipes of this new information superhighway. I wanted to be involved in creating the content of it. I didn't want to be just a blue shirt in Star Trek terms. I wanted to be a red shirt. I wanted to be involved in the forming of the world that was being formed around this new technology. I wanted to build something. And so things began to shift, and my wife and I joined YWAM as missionaries. And initially I thought that my focus would be helping people. There was a project about bringing remote classrooms in through video technology. I thought maybe that's something I could do. Or maybe I could be involved in outreach to hackers, go along to DEF CON conferences or things, and see how I could reach people of my own aesthetic, if you like, for the gospel. But in the end, it didn't work out like that way. As I was involved in this mission group, I was asked, "Do you know how to use Adobe Illustrator?" And my computer skills were used to create newsletters. I think it was the 1990s equivalent of, "Hey, tech guy, well done. Thank you for letting us use your skills. Can you put the PowerPoint together for us?" And so that was obviously dissatisfying, but into that hunger, the Lord used that and took me towards ministry, towards theological study, and in the end I laid down my tech world and jumped into a different world of theology and ministry, where different questions began to emerge. So that's my background, and that's where you can see how the tech part of me and the theology part of me began to emerge and to merge. And if you've got any questions, I'm very happy to receive them. Reach out, get in contact, and I'd love to have conversations. But that leads me as the basis to what I want to talk about in this talk, which is about the spirituality of technology. And so that's where we're going to go, and so we need to begin somewhere. And when I'm looking for a spirituality of technology, I'm looking not just for bland definitions, but for something that resonates with a sense of who we are as faith-based, tech-involved people. So I cheated a bit. I asked Grok AI for some definitions, and the first definition it gave me was this. It's sort of summarising the Oxford Dictionary, apparently, and it says, "Technology refers to the application of scientific knowledge for practical purposes, especially in industry. This definition encapsulates tools, machines, techniques, systems, methods used to solve real-world problems or to facilitate daily activities." And the question to ask there is this a definition that resonates with you? And it's a very pragmatic view of technology, and for me, this does not resonate. This doesn't get to the heart of the matter. There's an interface to this. Technology is meant to be useful and is meant to involve techniques and systems and methods, but that's not at the heart of it, certainly not at the spirit of it. So, doing a bit more digging, I was digging around, and Grok introduced me to someone called Schatzberg, who I haven't read much of, but the little that I did, Schatzberg talks about both an instrumental definition of technology, which was that first screen, but also a cultural definition, and then Grok again summarised for me, and I think this resonates much more. Technology involves the transformation of the material world. The transformation of the material world through human practices. Technology is seen as both the process of creation and the end result, imbued with human values and intentions. Now, I don't know about you, but when it comes to thinking about the why we are involved in tech and what resonates with us, what passions we have for it, this resonates more. And so one of the questions I have as we're exploring this concept of spirituality of technology is this definition. And so I've got questions which feel free to pause the next screen and to answer these questions in the comments. But things like, do you agree with this definition? What key words jump out for you? Do you have a better definition? And I want to focus in on the word creation there, the process of creation. Do you consider yourself as a faith-based, tech-involved person to be part of a creative industry? So there's the questions which you can discuss in below if you like. But as we explore this, that's a nice starting point, but to explore it we need to do theology. And to do theology we need to do things that are involved an abstraction, like I said before. One of the frameworks of theology is to bring things into a conceptual world, come to grips with them, extend them, extrapolate them, and apply them again. We're looking for patterns and principles. And one of the theological frameworks that's useful when we're looking at the scriptures and looking at the Bible is the framework in which we look at covenants. And I've put up some cheeky explanation of covenant on the screen for those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. But fundamentally, a covenant is simply an act of God that promises and binds and holds and defines his relationship with us as humans. As the story of history develops, we see that God works through promise, through binding himself to certain relationships and certain acts. So God binds himself in a covenant to Abraham and to his people so that they might be blessed to be a blessing. Later on, he strengthens that covenant in the time of Moses so that he can holds the people to faithfulness and holiness and defines the way and the means and the shape by which his blessings will flow. And then he later on strengthens that again by making another covenant, another promise with King David, binding himself to David's line so as to provide his people with someone who would lead them into the faithfulness and blessing and salvation that they long for. And of course, ultimately, this is all drawn together in a fulfillment of God's promise in Jesus himself, who is the new Abraham, the new Moses, the new David, the one who holds all these things and through whom blessings flow through God's people to the rest of the world. And I'm not going to unpack all that. We could spend a whole number of talks on that. But what I want to talk about is the first covenant right at the beginning in the book of Genesis, where God calls Adam and Eve to a way of life that's bound by his promise. So he promises them fruitfulness and increase. And in return, he's saying, that's your calling. Go be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and over living creatures that move on the ground. Or as the previous slide says, transform the material world through human practices. Let me see if I can put that up there. So go and transform the material world through human practices. In the words of Genesis, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds of the sky. Now, this isn't rocket science. We understand what this means. We are used to talking about what we call this creation covenant in terms of being active, creative humans. So some people are farmers and they get to subdue the earth, which means to steward it well. And some of us can be parents and increase in number. And all of us, no matter where we are, receive some of this common grace of God's blessing about what it means to be creative humans. But where does technology come into this? Now, we can take a pragmatic view. Subduing the earth requires tools. And as tech-involved people, we are a provider of tools. For most of us, they are information tools, but they are tools nonetheless. But I think there's actually something more essential than that. All that God is asking Adam and Eve to do here is, and this is a pattern in every covenant, is he asking them to do as he does. In Adam and Eve are images of God. They are expressions of God's self. He has put his image in them. And so just as God is creator, he is asking he's calling them to be creators themselves, to be fruitful and increase in number. And so they are walking in the promise of God as they embrace that creativity. But again, what does that mean for us? I've got one more step to take. Bear with me, and that step is to give my little rendition of my quick explanation of the Trinity. And so the Trinity begins with God the Father, and we have to understand that one of the reasons we refer to God using this parental language of our Father is that we understand something of the spirit of parenthood. When we are parents, we're not just about reproducing our DNA. We want to pour ourselves out into our children to impart to them something of our values, our priorities, our will, our hopes, our dreams. Well, all that is in us, we want to pour out. In the old language, that's called begetting. And so God the Father does that. The God being Father pours himself out continually. And it being God, he is both eternal and perfect. And so God the Father eternally and perfectly pours himself out. He begets eternally and perfectly another person, God the Son. And that's how they're differentiated. The Father is the one that begets, and the Son is the one who's begotten. But because it's eternal and perfect, whatever has emerged from God the Father over eternity past is a full representation of himself. There's no imperfection and there's no incompletion in his begetting. And so God the Son is not God the Father, but is of the same essence as God the Father. And so you have this sense of God the Father, God the Son being two persons, but one essence. And of course, we can look at each of those individually, God the Father and God the Son, but we can also look at what is being imparted, that which flows from the Father to the Son. Again, that is eternal and perfect. And so as we look at that which proceeds from the Father to the Son, and what proceeds from the Son to the Father, then what we are seeing is an eternal and perfect outpouring of God's self, and that outpouring is, we know, to be the Holy Spirit, as a processing out from the dynamics of that eternal and perfect relationship. Now, all this is eternal and perfect. There's never a time when this wasn't happening. There's never a time this wasn't the case. But we have this beautiful dynamic of one unity, one essence in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, that's all theologically abstract, but how does that apply to us? The question we need to ask is, what if God is creator, and if he's asking us to be creative as he is, then what form does the creative act of God take? For instance, we understand that Jesus says this: in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. So the creative act of God involves a word. That's a conceptual thing. It's a thing that we can speak and say. It's information. So what happens is that God the Father says, "Let there be light." The Son responds with a yes and amen. And so the word has been outpoured. The Son is the word that receives that outpouring. The yes and amen is expressed through the Spirit. And in that simple speech, if you like, within the Godhead itself, is the creative work. Simply by saying, "Let there be light," and the Son saying yes and amen, the Holy Spirit comes forth, and boom, there is light. And so the essence of the creativity of God is in the articulation of his imagination and his knowledge and his desire, and it's in the construct of symbols and ideas. His very creativity takes place in this world of word. His very thinking, his speaking, his articulation of the abstract is enough to make it real. And this is where we are called to be like him in the covenant. As he is a creator, let us be creative. So remember how I felt when I could create things in my Commodore 64, when I could think things and then help them emerge. Then in some ways I was rightly touching on something divine, something of the image of God in me. I was being creative as I am called to be creative, not just with my hands, but with the forming and shaping and creative power of the symbols, of the words within my own heart and soul. So, given that, here's my little assertion as we begin to talk about the spirituality of technology. This is assertion number one. This is food for thought, something from which we can gather our thoughts. And if you want to push back at this, feel free. But assertion number one, the creative foundation of technology is a form of worship. Creative foundation of technology is a form of worship. Now, I'm not just saying this for the sake of geeking out. I'm saying this to affirm who we are, whom you are, as tech-involved people. At Faithtech, we've pushed back at that caricature that you're good with computers, you can run the PowerPoint. Well done, you can be useful. There's a point, there's a purpose, and there's a foundation that's deeper than just the pragmatic. James Kelly, who founded Faithtech, speaks of a teleology of technology. That is, to dig into the purpose and the ends of technology. But I think we can dig a bit deeper, because in the end, teleology, purpose, derives from ontology, the essence, the being of something. And ontology, in the end, if we believe that our beginning is in God, rests upon a doxology, that is on a glorying of or a worshipping of God. And therefore any reflection of who God is an act of worship. If we reflect him well, if we reflect him truly, if we reflect him obediently, then we have glorified him. We have worshipped him well. And so it's not just in what we produce as tech-involved people, but in who we are, that there is a glory for God and a foundation on which we can rest. And pastorally, I also want to say this. What this means that in your work, in your thinking things through, in your grappling with tasks, you are not just merely useful. Your value to the kingdom doesn't just lie in what you can do pragmatically, it lies in who you are. The sheer delight of what your mind can draw together and hold together and then express into being. Like God, you can draw things into a symbolic space. You can apply algorithmic order that expands and reforms, and then you can have them expressed and made real in some form. It's a form of worship grounded in the promises and blessing of God. So that's assertion number one. That comes with a whole bunch of questions. If you want, you can pause the video here and ask these questions. I'd love to hear from you. But this is, like I said, these are at the very beginning. These are thoughts in process, and I want to know the sorts of questions that you are asking. But let's move on from this foundation. Given this assertion, what then is the place of technology within the way God works within his mission? If technology is simply about being pragmatically useful, then it's a neutral thing. We know this clearly. We know that we can build tools and technologies, and all technologies can be used for good and for evil. There's a neutrality in it. But there's a difference between being passively neutral and actively neutral. Passive neutrality is when something is benign. A rock is neither bad nor good. A blade of grass is neither bad nor good. These things are neutral in a passive way. They simply are, and they have in their essence no real contribution to make. But technology is actively neutral. It can be used for good or bad. It's neutral, but it is never passive. It has power and dynamism. For good or for ill, it's creative dynamism. It is involved and caught up in the transformation of creation. It's an expression of our God-given calling to create as God created, and that is a powerful and dynamic effect. We can use technology for good or for evil, but you can never not use it. It can never not have effect, even if it's not used. And the touch point of this, of course, is the atom bomb. And if you've seen Oppenheimer, it explores these options. Used or unused, the technology itself affects us simply by being. And that's obvious for any technology, especially when it derives from a step change in our understandings. The first time that information could travel faster than a horse was a step change in human experience, and nothing would be the same. The Gutenberg press, the first transistor, the first large language model to pass the Turing test, when it's not just a manipulation of the known, but has that extension, when the symbolic world in which things have been thought about expands into a new way of embracing and manipulating the world, it produces experiences that have never been known before, and they can never be a passive thing. It will always have an effect. This is why Arthur C. Clarke famously said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. When that step change happens, something magic happens, and in some ways the technologists become the magicians. But if we return to where we started just a moment ago, this assertion that about technology is a form of worship, and then that gives us a way into what the scriptures might reveal. If technology is an expression of creativity, then its positive life-giving power, because it can't be passive, it will always do something. When it's positive and life-giving, that something happens when it's used in an alignment with the purposes of God, when it's used in a worshipful way. The fundamental purpose of creation is worship, and the heavens declare the glory of God. And so there's another little framework that might help us explore this as we get into the scriptures. We looked at covenants before, but another little framework we can hold is the framework of a temple. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but a temple is a place where God meets with his creation, where things are set apart within creation for a revelation of God's truth and glory, and a touch of his presence. So the earth is set apart within the universe to be a place of God's particular intent to be revealed and for worship to happen. The Garden of Eden is a place set apart within the earth, where God's place is not just God places not just the first humans, but places them, if you like, as priests, as images, as representatives of him amongst all the other creatures. Adam and Eve are called to reveal him. As Abraham comes on the scene, we see that there is a family that is set apart and a promised land that is set apart. As Moses comes on the scene, we see that there's a mountain which is like a temple where they can encounter with God. And we understand that from that place, a traveling temple, a tabernacle goes forth until eventually a temple is built in Jerusalem, and the imagery continues through the story. There's temples upon temples. Mary is a temple. The church becomes a temple as we are filled with God's Spirit. And ultimately, we are looking ahead to the promised city of God, where there's no need of a temple, because the Lamb of God, Jesus himself, is present in his fullest way. So what's that got to do with us? Well, here's this. If technology is to be worshipful, if it's to be lined up with God's purposes, we need to understand that one of the things, well, almost the first and foremost thing that any new technology does is it builds temples. It builds temples, either true ones or false ones. So, for instance, here's a story from the early parts of the Bible. This is an act of technology. Noah is appointed by God as a maritime engineer, and he creates a little floating temple, a world within a world where God is present, holding the representatives of creation in like a little stasis chamber as the world is unmade and remade around him. It's within this built temple that the promises of God can continue. So this is technology as an act of worship, an act that flows with the purposes of God. But not long after this story, there's this story, the Tower of Babel. And in Genesis 11, we see that there's a technology shift. Bricks are invented. Somewhere, someone has abstracted the concept of a rock. Rather than just saying, how do we arrange rocks, they've made a step change in technology. Why don't we make our own rocks? Look, we can be a deeper creator. What an excellent tool we have. We now have bricks, and it's not benign. They are going to be used, whether we like it or not. And what did they do with this technology that they had found? They tried to build a temple, and the form of the temple is not a tower. The form of the temple they tried to build is actually a mountain, because mountains are where the gods live in their mindset. Gods live in wild places and mountains. And so here they're trying to build a mountain that comes from them, from their own divine creativity, a mountain that's on their terms. It's as if to say, we don't need your creation, O God. We can make our own rocks. We can establish our own divinity. We don't need you. And so here there is a use of technology that does not align with the purposes of God, which is not worshipful. And so this leads me to assertion number 2. Technology leads to worship through the building of temples. It either leads to true worship or to idolatrous worship. Idolatry is simply the worship of creation in place of creator, and more precisely it's this: God has made us in his image, and idolatry attempts to make him in our image. God has made us in his image, and in idolatry we attempt to make him in our image. Technology gives us the tools by which we attempt that. We either use technology to reflect his image, or we use technology to try and overcome his image. And that's been how it is throughout the ages. From developments in engineering and transport and communications and material science, it's never been benign. We've built colosseums to persecute Christians and cathedrals to honour God. Technology builds temples. It will either be used to elevate God's purpose or to shape ourselves by what we are most besotted by powerful might, by seduction with the intellect, the idols of fertility and lust, or whatever it may be. Technology allows us to pursue God or our idols. And at the moment, the current culmination of that is, I think, AI. Now, I'm not want to make this talk about AI, but I asked Grok, outline the correlations between yourself and a deity, and it was quite honest with me. You see, we talk about AI and robotics as sometimes as an attempt to make something in our image, but it's more than that. AI is our attempt to make God. AI is something that we can carry around in our pockets, who will give us information we don't know, who can give us advice for directing our future, and it's benign and it's beautiful, and we will bow down and query it like an oracle in the end. I wonder if you can see that. But let's return to this assertion. Technology leads to worship. What do you think? As before, there's a bunch of questions, and if you'd like to ask and answer them, I'd love to have your questions and your conversation and your comments at the end. Is this sort of thing useful to you? Is there anything I've missed? I'd love to know how I could strengthen my argument. How does this guide our sense of responsibility as people who develop tech? And can we see how how technology has been a mission in its own right, not just a form of usefulness? But most importantly, there's a question there. What temples are we building in our work? Again, so if this is the case, if we are agreeing with this assertion, and you don't have to, but I'd love to hear your pushback. If this is the case, then does this give a way of thinking about the ethical framework of technology? Given these two options, how can we ensure that we help technology to be at its worshipful best? And as we do this, I'm trying to steer clear of utilitarian arguments. this tech is good because it leads to these results. So I'm looking for more to do with the character and the essence of technology in itself. What might we do to explore that? Well, one of the people that I find very useful on this is this guy, Jonathan Padjo. You can look him up. He has a podcast called The Symbolic World. In my mind, if we talked about that sense of bringing things into the abstract world in which we can then deal with them and then bring them back out, then Jonathan Padjo is something like a meta software engineer. He pulls the history and stories and politics and everything into a symbolic world where he can then draw the threads together, find the patterns and the processes, and then see what conclusions and actions can come from them. Padjo does this. And from one of the things that when he talks about technology, and I'm sort of praising him very intently here, is that he can see how technology can encapsulate this sense of false worship in two ways. The first is when technology itself is made a god. And there's a case in point. Here is a picture of someone receiving a tattoo in Jerusalem. They are a pilgrim. They have gone to Jerusalem as an act of devotion, and they are now marking in their very skin a symbol of their act of worship, and their alignment towards a holy place, a holy good, is now marked on them very selves. It's an act of worship. If that's the case, then what's this guy doing? He's marking his skin in the same way. I used to joke that sometimes people who loved Apple had Stockholm syndrome. And I actually heard someone say, "Oh, Apple is opening a store in the mall near me. I love you, Apple." But I know that is overplaying it, and Apple in many ways is just a brand. It's not really a tech. But this sort of thing happens, and we can certainly see how people with addictive behaviours towards social media and all sorts of things are expressing a form of worship towards tech. And as technologists, people involved in tech, one of the things that we know is that we know what's behind the curtain. Back in the day when idols were made out of wood and rock and carved timber, the people who knew most powerfully that these idols were just man-made creations were the ones who had actually done the carving. We are the ones who have put the tech together. We know that they are not divine. Perhaps we are the ones who are able to dethrone the idols. We are the ones who are able and well qualified to say, it's just a phone. It's just a piece of tech. This isn't as real as you think it is. This is just a world made by human hands. We can help keep people's eyes on reality. So perhaps that's helpful as we seek to align technology with worship. Secondly, though, there's other aspects of which we can look about, which we can grasp from Jonathan Padjo's thinking, and that is to recognise that technology can come in two forms. So, for instance, here is a piece of technology. Here is a piece of technology that is an instrument. It produces music. A lot of thought has gone into making it. The creativity that produces this instrument is only matched by the creativity that goes into playing it. To play this instrument takes discipline. It costs you something. Your fingers might literally bleed as you learn to express your very soul through this instrument that will produce beautiful music. Now here's another ancient piece of technology that produces music. It's not an instrument, it's a device. This device produces music, but in this sense, it's not cost-free. To get music out of this device, you just have to press a button. And while it's not necessarily a form of evil, it's a form of technology that might diminish creativity as much as it enhances it. And see, there's another thing about the word device. The word device is used in another sense. It's used when talking about magic. An occultic device is a similar thing. In a computer game like Skyrim, you can cast a spell. You're casting a device. And just through pressing a button, you make something happen. And so there's this fine line between technology that is instrument, that is a form of expressing your very soul, and technology that is a device, which is cost-free, where there is a not an investment of yourself, and indeed a greater chance of losing yourself. So as we come to the end of this talk, this is my final assertion. True worship costs, but technology can make things easy. So how can we parse what we do through that probable truth? How can we do it in a way that we are allowing people to use technology that's useful, but not in a way where they might lose their soul in so doing it? In fact, conversely, how can we provide tools that are actually instruments that help people find their soul, express their soul? One of the things is that as people involved in tech, just like what I shared of my story in the beginning, tech itself for us is an instrument. We are invested in it. We can see the beauty of it. We can express our soul creatively through our code or our designs or whatever it may be. We know what level of investment has gone into it. Tech is our music and our song, but for others, it's not. It's a magical thing built by wizards for them to use. So I wonder what you think about this. I haven't got an answer to this question that progresses on from this thought, other than to ask, what do you think? I want to know your views on this. I want to explore with you. And so I'm going to leave it there. On the night when we had this talk, we then stopped and we broke into small groups and talked and we prayed together. And so I just want to thank you for listening and for being with me the other night in Sheffield. And I hope this finds it useful. Please do reach out if you want to chat. I'd love to have a coffee with you. But for now, bless you very much.